So tonight we host John Miller and Anna Ostoya for Out in the Photographic Field. John and Anna are both artists who are typically known for their practices outside the medium of photography, but tonight they come together to each discuss one ongoing photographic series. They were originally brought together to share their series in the 2022 exhibition Warhol, People and Things by curators Barbara Piotrowski and Anna Claire Feldman in Porto. So John will present on his middle-of-the-day photographs, which candidly record the ongoings of life wherever he is between the hours of 12 noon and 2 p.m. And Anna will discuss her memorabilia series, which juxtaposes two found images to evoke provocations about the cyclical nature of media narratives. After the conversation concludes tonight, there will be no official Q&A, but please do join us at the bar for a drink and continue informal conversation. And with that, I'll pass it on to John and Anna. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. So Anna's going to start by talking about her memorabilia series.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Let me say a few things about my series, which is a sort of a personal archives of images which I pair based on their visual similarity. And I find them mostly on internet. It's unlike John, who finds, where do you find, John, your images? How do you start your series?
Oh, I photograph them myself.
Well, what I do might be also called photography, but you know what I do? I take screenshots. So,
do you use Google search, image search to find? Well, maybe I'm jumping the gun with that question.
No, that's a good question because, you know, I don't use Google search. I serve the news outlets. So, you know, I'm an avid reader of the news. And in around 2020 or 21, I got myself a new phone with a larger screen, and it had this app which would allow me to follow a few news outlets. I have my dad, who is 102, gave me that advice when I was a teenager, that if you want to learn something about what's going on in the world, you always have to follow the widest possible spectrum of the press. So you should read the newspapers on the right, as well as those on the left, and the large media, important media newspapers, and also local newspapers. And also he used that metaphor, read between the lines. And he said, everything is propaganda to a bigger or smaller degree. On my phone, I don't know if I read between the lines, but I definitely got attracted to the images, and I looked at them carefully, and I started taking these screenshots. And soon my photo archives on my phone filled up with the screenshots, and my brain started playing these associative games of putting images together based on how they looked like. Not so much on the story. So
you didn't search specific images out?
No.
It's more like you sort of cast a wide net and then had a big folder full of images.
Yeah. You know, it was like, I think it was the time of the pandemic. I don't know if it happened to you, but did you start reading more news during the pandemic than usual?
No.
I think lucky you, because I got a bit addicted, you know, and especially as my phone had that function of like the news popping up as my messages. And I think I was, you know, behind it, there was this desperation, like waiting where finally some good news, like a piece of good news will show up on my phone. But also when you start reading articles for diverse news outlets, when you are, then it, you know, it becomes exciting because the same piece of news is just described in two different ways, and the same image is used for different purposes. And let me just give an example or like explain one work maybe a bit more. So in 2020, I saw that image in an article about COVID tracking. And I felt attracted to it because it reminded me of this other image of the crowds, an image which I remembered from a book by Guy Debord, Society of Spectacle, which is a famous photo from 1954 of crowds watching a 3D movie in 3D glasses. And it's an iconic photo, right? It's a photo which like represents passive consumerism. You probably could describe it much better.
And a spectacle.
And a spectacle,
Yeah.
right.
And the glasses kind of underline that.
Right. In reality, supposedly the crowd wasn't really mesmerized by the spectacle, but quite critical of it. They didn't like the glasses, they didn't like what they were seeing on the screen. And it's the only photo in which everyone is just sitting silently and looking mesmerized rather than critical to what they are seeing. Anyway, the image has been used multiple times and even used by artists such as Barbara Krugel. The image which I saw in the article about COVID, it's been also used multiple times in articles about, for example, health, but also French language, also fashion. And it turns out that it was a photo of the crowds in Paris in 2017, photographing a fashion show, which for the first time took place on Champs-Élysées. And there were like some stars like Jane Fonda instead of regular like models. So, you know, the both images kind of describe, like have an iconic, represent symbolically society in a certain moment, but also what really happens, what the really situation was, maybe stands in opposition to the meaning which is attached to them. Like the photo of the people photographing became like mainly used in the articles about our addiction to smartphones and our inability to process anything without it.
Yeah, that's what I get when I read that photo, that people are like each isolated in their own world rather than, at least the people who are looking at the spectacle are in a kind of communal space or something. But that's not really what's going on, that they're...
No, it was a unique event. It was for the first time that actually a fashion show took place on Champs-Élysées, and also for the first time that general audience was invited to it. Usually, you know, these events are closed. But what I want to say that this, you know, I didn't know all of that when I was making the work. I followed my intuition when I made the piece. And I think this fact of fragmentary knowledge is part of the series. We never know what the image represents, and the interpretation of the image can change.
Yeah, and I think for that reason, the caption is important, or the captions, you have two. Do you write them, or do you take them from news stories?
No, I do write them, and indeed the captions are, I think, more important than the titles. This is from Porto, from the exhibition in Porto. It was like a leaflet which visitors could take with them, and it's part of the work, I think, to give a bit of information about the images, so people can research further, Google if they want to. It's very different than in your work, right?
Yeah. So the captions, in effect, are they the titles then of these diptychs, or?
No, because they are too long, but I always want them to be presented, like available to the audience. In your case, you don't really use any captions, right? Or any much information when you present your works from in your series.
Each work is untitled with the date it was shot in parentheses, and then for cataloging purposes, they all have inventory numbers that aren't officially part of the title, but since I sometimes shoot several images on the same day, I have to distinguish between them.
So why is time more important to you than place?
I guess because usually when I see the image, I can remember the place, but I don't feel compelled to tell the viewer where it is. I mean, part of we're jumping ahead a bit, but part of what I was after was maybe much of my work would qualify, I guess, as street photography, which I sometimes feel a little bit guilty about. But one thing I was after was what happens when you're in a public space. How much do you know? How much can you know? And even if you know a lot, your knowledge of that space is always fragmentary. So I'll go into that more later.
So we share the word fragmentary appears in both our presentations. Let me give a few examples of my previous works which relate to this series. And this is the proof that I've been interested in the news and newspapers for a very long time. These are my collages which I made around 2007 and 2011. And I've made quite a few series based on newspapers, and I would use newspapers as a source for images, but then also as a source for patterns and colors and even textures, such as, I just shredded the newspapers to get papier-mâché, to make papier-mâché, and that would be also used on the on canvas. The series, which is maybe precedes the memorabilia series the most, is a series called Autopsies, which was shown here in New York in New Photography Show. And it was based on images found in art history books and history books. And here I tried to pair images together which looked alike, but one of the images would be the more iconic internationally, and the other more iconic only, or known only locally. And also, these images, I would then develop like sculptural forms for these images. This is, for example, a work called female pseudomorphism. I call this method of putting images which look alike together as pseudomorphic method.
Is this all one work, or is this
is one work?
Separate?
It's one work, like a triptych of 3 portraits. And here, not only the image, like what's represented looks alike, but also the stories are sort of similar. For example, you have Eva Hesse and Alina Shapochnikov photographed in their studios. And you can, when you think about them and read about them, you know that both of them had traumatic Second World War experiences. Both of them experimented with new materials which were harmful, and both of them died of tumor. So that's true for all these pieces in all this series, but there is overlap in the visual part, but also in the story. And another piece from the series, both images are from 1964. Both represent or show students protesting, but one image is from New York, students protesting against Vietnam War, and another one is from Warsaw, students protesting against the communist government. And this piece kind of goes in the corner. Mm-hmm. Is it okay with my mic? I kind of... Okay, thank you.
So you've described some of these juxtapositions, or maybe all of them, as pseudomorphic.
Yeah.
Is that an art historical term specifically, or?
No, it comes from mineralogy. Mineralogy.
Oh, okay. Okay, I wasn't sure if it was like Panofsky or something.
No, it's something about like minerals looking alike but actually being different, or having like showing the same qualities but actually belonging to different groups. Mm-hmm.
So there's something about that that's kind of defeating the camera, which is something that one of my teachers, Douglas Hubler, was very concerned with. You know, for example, in one of his, I think it was a variable piece, he was photographing bird calls in Central Park. So basically he would point his camera in the direction of a bird call, shoot it, that was the image, or he'd photograph twins, you know, so you know, so it's like stressing how the camera stays on the surface of things, and that the information about an image isn't synonymous with knowledge, you know, or he was trying to like show what the limitations of the camera are.
Yeah, and also limitations, I think, of us as those who look at the photographs, right?
Yeah, yeah.
We never know what we look at.
Right.
This kind of way of working through associations has been also present in my painting, and most of my paintings are based on found images. This is an example. Can you guess maybe on which photo this one is based or no?
So wait,
can you guess what photo I used to make this painting?
This one,
yeah,
Cecil Beaton's photograph of a model in front of Pollock's Lavender Mist.
Yes,
yeah.
yes. We didn't. He didn't really know. Yes, that's the photo I used. An iconic photo, right? An iconic photo or a photograph. Also, it is an iconic photograph. This is Cecil Beaton.
Yeah.
It marks.
I mean, I didn't know about that till I read Pollock's. There was like a biography that came out like 15 years ago, and I didn't know about his connection to fashion and store window display.
Right, but it was also like the first time when abstract art, which was considered outsiders art, was suddenly presented as you know, part of luxurious lifestyle, because the photo was for the Vogue magazine, from what I read. Right?
But also, like, we think of Warhol in terms of pop, but because Pollock was so photogenic, and he was also like really aware of his appearance. And you know, at one point he went through like an Edwardian dandy phase. One point he dressed like Thomas Hart Benton, his teacher. He was like very aware of his personal image, and also back when Life magazine was a powerful media outlet, that made him really the first American artist superstar, because they ran a photo profile of Pollock, photographed by, I believe, Hans Nemeth, and you know, he was very charismatic, and
it's all based on the looks, like career and performance.
Yeah, I mean, it played out differently with Warhol, but
okay, another example. Here's an example of a collage or composition on canvas where I collage parts of newspapers, but I also paint. And you have a mirror image of two protesters. One is a protester on Maidan Square in Ukraine, and another one is from a protester from Ferguson. Both images are from 2014. I actually reused this pairing as a work in the memorabilia series.
But going back to that collage, where the textured parts, are those paper mache?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they're made up from the newspapers that you glean the images from?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think this, you know, material aspect has been always important to me.
Yeah.
And yet another work example of associations between images. One work is a page from an art history book, and these are Nazis marching under l'Arc de Triomphe in Paris. And the other image is a cover of a chocolate box, which I got in a discount store next to where I live here in New York. Okay, and yeah, now I want to talk a bit about the references and people who inspired us. And this person is someone close to you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I really was fascinated by the gasoline station series as much as I was fascinated by Cindy Sherman's film stills. And, you know, I think I like them so much because I felt that they awaken certain feeling of alienation and déjà vu, to which I could very much relate to. But I found that feeling, you know, somehow, I felt that there is like critical potential in it, because these images like when make me think, ask questions like, what am I seeing? Where have I seen, like, where have I seen similar image? And there is like, they produced an active viewer, something that I am very much interested in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, these, the untitled film stills especially, I think, get at notions of performativity of identity and how that involves a repetition, and, you know, really points to femininity as a construct, as is masculinity, but, you know, she was zeroing in on stereotypes of femininity, and then how media images, here I think chiefly film images, actually shape the imagination of what women can be, or maybe can't be too. So I think all that's like packed into a fairly simple mode of image making in this case.
Yeah, I think I relate to it because, you know, my approach to reality is always to see it not as something unique, but as sort of repetition of something else. It might be just the fact, you know, that I've lived in a few places. Maybe it's kind of a way how one perceives reality, like a migrant way of perceiving reality. You always have to make sense of what you see, and it always brings back memories from other places. Yeah, maybe, you know, that's why I have this interest in the idea of repetition, déjà vu, and echoing.
Yeah. And then also, I mean, in this series, more than any other, she did a lot of the shots in public space, and she must have had someone else who was the camera operator.
Mm. Supposedly, sometimes it was her dad and also her boyfriend, Robert Longo, at the time. I like the idea of her dad taking pictures of her and being involved in her art project. And these are my, you know, historical references. I love the first photomontage artists, Hannah Ho or Hartfield. And I also found Benjamin's Passagenwerk very, very important and really inspiring. It's a collage of text where he collages his like his own notes and kind of theoretical writing with quotes he finds, right? And it was a project he worked on for 13 years. So it's an example of trying to find another way to describe reality and to define what one sees, because it was based on his strolls through arcades in Paris.
Right, and what's challenging about reading the Passagenwerk is that Benjamin doesn't necessarily believe everything that the citations say. He's making a juxtaposition so that sometimes it can expose like the ideology or the power dynamics that go into, you know, that particular expression.
Mm-hmm. Let me say that it's important for me not only to compose my the works in Memorabilia series on the computer, but to print them and also to make them into objects, little objects. I print them and I mount them on panels which are 6 by 3 inches and 1 inch deep, and then I paint the edge. I guess there is like this, again, this idea of wanting to make the images and what they represent somehow tangible. It's not the only way how I would present the works, but that's the way how I like to keep them for myself also in my studio. And that's how the works were look like when shown together, and that's a shot from Porto, how they were presented in Porto. I think we can go into your part of slides, and I can handle with this little device.
Okay. So another artist I studied with when I was in school was John Baldessari, and he got me into video. And I remember one time I was having a meeting with John, and he said, "Do you think you'll ever do any photography?" And without hesitation, I said no. And then years later, like I studied with John in 78, 79. And then years later, I guess in 93, around 93, I was invited to take part in an exhibition in Berlin called Getting to Know You that was centered on the AIDS epidemic. And at the time I was making a lot of work with a brown impasto trope that was supposed to connote excrement as a kind of provocation. And I think the curators wanted to include that work in the show, but I felt it didn't especially have to do with the AIDS epidemic. So I wanted to do something specific. So what I did was and this was my first real time I photographed things other than documenting my paintings and sculpture with a camera. So I went to the location.
Were you good at photo documenting? It's not easy to document sculpture. Were you good at that?
Initially, no, but when I came to Berlin and spent a year there making work and had a DAAD grant, there was a very good sculpture photographer who shot my work for the catalog and that I made in conjunction with my exhibition. And he was a really generous guy. He told me exactly what he was doing and why. So I learned from him. And he also like rejected the idea that you need 3 images of a sculpture. He said, people only look at one. He said, you have to find out like what the point of the work is and photograph that. So it's not just like photographing an object. You have to understand how the object reads. And even though I had made these sculptures, it never occurred to me that, oh yeah, you should photograph what the work's about. I was thinking of it as an empirical process. But anyway, I improved after this guy shot my work. But anyway, what I did for the Getting to Know You show was to look up the locations of sex clubs that closed or either were closed after the onset of the AIDS epidemic, and just went to those places and photographed the facades. So in a way, it was a kind of, in some way taking my cue from Hubler, photographing something that wasn't there. But also I wanted to photograph the disappearance of a culture or a subculture in the wake of this disease. And this was a time, for example, when Ronald Reagan's friend Rock Hudson died because of AIDS, but Reagan wouldn't say the word AIDS, so there was like a whole politicization of the epidemic.
I see it very much in the vein of Passagenberg, like documenting something what belongs to the bygone era to also make understand what's going on right now in the moment.
I could see that, like also like the idea that that when Benjamin wrote about the arcades, they were already like a dated predecessor to department stores, and like the kind of unwanted, like just out of fashion items in the store windows are what inspired the surrealists. I think that's one thing that, in fact, drew Benjamin to the arcades. Sometimes the address of a place would fall between the cracks if something new was constructed. That was the case with this Holiday Inn. The address I was looking for no longer existed.
How did you know how did you look up the locations?
I went to the New York Public Library and I found back issues of the Village Voice, and I looked in the classified ads section where these clubs would advertise. And anyway, long story short, I called this series Clubs for America. And when the show opened in Berlin, which has for many years had a very engaged queer community, there was a big turnout for the show. It was an important show, but very little attention was paid to my work because I was in effect showing people nothing or an absence. And it was only later that the work started to acquire an audience, but it was during the opening, it was pretty much ignored. And understandably, I wasn't giving people much to go on. Anyway, on to my influences. This is a work by John Baldessari, and it was part of a series of throwing balls in the air to try to get a line. Ed Ruscha, and this really affected Clubs for America because he photographed as real estate opportunities these various vacant lots that to me look suspicious because they were for sale, and maybe they were for sale because they were unwanted, but also the for sale signs made you aware of the land as a commodity, and it raised questions about who owns the land, who has the right to it. To me, they're rightfully disturbing images that aren't at all sensational.
Do you know if he really researched the locations, or it was more like an outcome of driving around?
I don't know. It's funny because when I went back to teach at CalArts, I had Ruscha's son as a student, Eddie Ruscha, who I think went on to become a bass player. I've kind of lost contact with him. And I had written about his books for Parquet, but then I think Ed Ruscha never told his son I'm an important artist, and he asked me, like, do you know who my father is? And, of course. I was impressed with that.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Dan Graham, Homes for America, which he characterized as a pseudo-sociological study. And my title, Clubs for America, clearly derives from this. And then the other thing, the funny thing for me is, although I showed with Metro Pictures, when I first came to New York, and the first gallery opening I ever went to was at Artist Space. It was Douglas Crimp's Pictures exhibition. But I really didn't know like what the picture sensibility was. I mean, it was all new to me. And my idea of working with a scenario, in fact, was inspired by having read Raymond Roussel's Impressions of Africa. And at the time, the translation of that book didn't feature the illustrations that Roussel commissioned from Henri Zo, where he just gave Zoe descriptions of scenes that did not appear in the narrative, so that the images were kind of like a semi-autonomous narrative of their own. And it wasn't till later that I actually saw these drawings. But I was intrigued with this idea of like how the scenario functions as a picture of reality, and also as a kind of, I was interested in a kind of normative picture. So that led to my shooting the middle of the day photographs. And these are photos that I shoot between 12 and 2. They can be of anything that carries through that period. I chose that period because it's my least favorite time of day. But then
Yeah,
I started, as I got into it, I started asking myself why. And
that's the question I had, because you write, I think in one of your texts you say, it's the most depressing time of the day. And I think to many people, it's just the best time of the day. They finally get break from work, you know, they can have lunch.
yeah, well, there's also the Protestant work ethic where it's virtuous to work through lunch and, you know, push on till 5 o'clock or after. So there's that conflict between the desire to rest and the imperative to work.
So you feel guilty. That's when the guilt kicks in around that time.
Yeah, there's guilt involved in that for sure. And also, little did I know that traditional photographers consider that to be the worst time of day to take a photograph, because the sun can be directly overhead. And so anyway, I just jumped into shooting anything. I was interested in just what, not so much documenting the time, because the time can't be documented, but using it as a framework. So I didn't want to necessarily show people rushing through lunch or something like that, but anything that carries over through that time period. And at first when I was working with a film camera and printing my own photographs, and there was the idea that as a novice photographer, you start small, and then when you get better, you make bigger prints. And when I made my first set of big prints, I really ultimately didn't like them. They felt kind of bloated. And I think, so I tend to print them on either 8.5 by 11 or A4 paper. So the images are about this big. So it's more book-sized, and I think it makes sense to me because it has like some relation to a diary or something like that.
So how when you compare them printed small and you compare them on Instagram, as you now post them on Instagram, which format do you prefer?
I think maybe the prints, but I mean, with photography, the technology it's never been one medium really. It's been like a bundle of media. So even like I started the series in '94, and so many things have changed, you know, and sometimes I make choices for kind of pseudo reasons. Like I like to make inkjet prints on luster paper because it looks like the old kind of paper I made C prints on, you know. So, but you know, you could use a matte paper, you could print on watercolor paper, you know, with inkjet or anything.
And when you were printing them, was it like the quality was very important to you? Would you like, you know, go for this like perfect print?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Within the range of my ability, yes. But what I didn't go for was things like spectacular angles or sensational subjects that I wanted to have to do. I wanted them to have to do with everyday life in some way. And this idea, I mean, it connects to Freud and surrealism and situationism, that we think of the everyday as banal typically, but then it's because we become acculturated to do that, and we can miss what is really there.
Yeah, I find them beautifully suspended between some sort of a snapshot, and associated with like amateur photography, and with well composed, like experienced photographer kind of photo. And I'm wondering, how are you negotiating it? For example, if you see something, do you take a few shots of the same thing, or not?
It depends. I mean, before I started using my phone a lot, which I started using my phone one time when I didn't have batteries for my camera and I was somewhere where I really wanted to shoot. So I reluctantly turned to my phone and then found it was pretty good. And since then, it's only gotten better. So I used to go out and shoot a lot. Now I produce more photos, but I just, like everybody else, my phone's always with me. So when I remember, I'll pull out my phone and shoot wherever I am.
Can I ask you when that transition from around which year that took place, from going out like with a camera to?
I mean, it's not an absolute, I never go out with a camera, but it started about 7 years ago. And then after that, I also started posting on Instagram. But it's funny, one time I did an interview and someone asked me like, why do you have so few followers? So some of these are film, some of these are digital.
And they also serve as an archive for other works, right? For example, the show I saw in Dallas, which had this beautiful, enormous wallpaper or like print on the wall, and which was on one side had an image from Łódź in Poland. Imagine I was in Dallas over Christmas, so I just saw all these Christmas decorations. And when I enter a gallery, and they are spectacular in Dallas, like whole houses, whole lawns, whole trees, everything is in lights. And when I enter a gallery there, and what I see, something familiar. It looks like it's kind of communist, and it was an image from Łódź, and it was transitioned into an image from Korea, right? But these images came from the series, or not?
I think I shot all the constituent parts from that montage between 12 and 2, but then I wasn't using my phone for that. A couple years back, I worked as a creative director for Balenciaga for their ready-to-wear, and I think it was like their 2022 ready-to-wear and accessories lines. And I requested that their photographer use a middle format camera. The guy showed up with a Fujifilm camera, and at first I thought, like, why are they skimping? And little did I know that that was considered like the best middle format camera. But so anyway, after that, I got my own Fujifilm camera with the proceeds from the Balenciaga job, and since I was blowing those images up, I shot them in middle format so they could hold up to enlargement without obvious pixelation.
Yeah, I think there are now these new technologies make it possible to enlarge a photo, which is even in small resolution, into a big one with good quality. But I'm not an expert.
Yeah, I mean, this is going off a little bit on another tech, but I've done wall graphics for a while, but what I used to do was to posterize an image, turn it into a vector file, and then you can blow it up without pixelization. So anyway, not to get too nerdy about it, but now I don't have to do that, and I can do it in color. And I guess maybe one last thing I'd like to add about this was just, I was thinking about also this prospect of photographing nothing and what it means. And I think in some ways, I'm afraid of nothing, and you know, not having something to do, then you have to confront your own feelings. Like if you're like busy, you don't have to like be introspective. There've been a couple times when curators have paired my work with Ankawara's paintings, and I think a lot about, even though he's a painter, he made paintings kind of like an apparatus, and doing one a day. And I don't always shoot midday photos every day, but I try to, you know, there's still like a relation to dates in a diary. But then, you know, it chronicles his life until he's not there anymore. And I remember one performance that Arakawa did where he set up like a production line, you know, so it's like partly a joke where he had people producing Ankawara paintings like an assembly line. But I think that that was reflecting the apparatus quality of Ankawara's work, which I think very much resonates with the camera as an apparatus. And you know, I also think of like his postcard pieces where, you know, it's stamped, "I got up." You know, so it's just like the most basic condition of living that you can identify.
And when you started the project, you thought that it would take, you know, you started it in 1994.
Right.
So you thought that it would be like a decade-long project?
I didn't think about an end to it.
But it's like part of your like the way you live, right? You're just like from time to time when you have.
But there were years when maybe I only shot 40 photos a year. You know, there were some like lean years in terms of image production. But someone asked me like how many photos are in the series, and I can't really say because I just have you know, an 8 terabyte hard drive with all my midday files. And then the question is, even when does one become a work? You know, because I save what I shoot. Sometimes I go back and things that at first that I think are no good, I end up liking, you know, my opinion changes.
And again, you have one shot of the same situation or a few shots of the same situation?
Both.
Both.
Yeah, depending on when and where. And also what's the same? That's the other question.
But that's the dilemma of, I think a lot of people like now taking multiple shots of a same baby or the same thing they see and they're like deciding which one is the best.
Yeah. Yeah, so I don't know, difference in repetition, I guess, is. That wasn't staged.
Do you have a feeling of deja vu when taking the pictures or when looking at the images in your archives? You know, when you see the image, because you photograph here in New York, you also live partially in Berlin, you take pictures there. Do you have that feeling like when you photograph something, oh, that situation just reminds me of all these other pictures I took in the past? Or do you see the situations as unique, you know? Like, and also when you look in your archives, like when you see an image, does it recall a memory of another image or does it recall a specific situation when you were taking this picture?
Well, now there can be like a lot of nostalgia attached to them that, you know, wasn't there when I initially shot them. And then there are kind of, I become aware of like typologies of subject matter that recur. Probably the thing that is most challenging for me is to shoot a portrait, because then the process is different. But I mean, I've shot candid photos of people in public, but I also tried for one exhibition I was doing, I really wanted to balance portrait, landscape, and still life, because I feel like I'm too much in the landscape. And so I asked some friends if I could photograph them, and it was much harder than shooting a street scene for me. So, Anna, I am the camera's eye. I am the machine that shows you the world as I alone see it.
The photograph of a missing being will touch me like with lay rays of a star.
Photographs are the most mysterious of all things that make up our environment, our modern environment.
Photography is empathy towards the world.
The photograph always astonishes me with an astonishment that always renews itself.
Photography is love and death.
To collect photographs is to collect the world.
Fossils work almost the same way as photography.
Photographs shock because they show something novel.
I want to photograph touching, poignant, or queer things.
I try to photograph what can't be photographed, subjective reality, which seems more real than what you usually see.
I find my early pictures quite funny. Today, I look for comedy more and more.
To see something as a photograph is to encounter a potential object of fascination.
I would rather take a photograph than be one.
I never read, I just look at photographs.
Cameras are addictive fantasy machines.
Now everything cries out in all imaginable colors, but it cries out to deaf ears.
The blizzard of photographs betray an indifference to what the things mean.
Throughout the artist's lifetime, he will document to the extent of his capacity the existence of everyone alive.
Just about everything has been photographed, or so it seems.
The photographic universe graphs the world as a function of photographs.
Photography implies capturing the largest possible number of subjects.
The flood of photos sweeps away the dams of memory.
One redundant photograph replaces another redundant photograph.
If I could turn back the pages of history and photograph just one person, that would be Moses.
Ghosts are simultaneously comical and terrifying.
What I feel about photographs derives from a certain training, an average effect.
Photography appears as a jumble that consists partly of garbage.
I like photography, so I like all photographs. I like all photographers, even if they're lousy.
Photographing a human likeness is a political act.
The camera will never capture you.
To be photographed with a silly, foolish smile is forever damning.
The camera machine cannot evade the objects before it.
The camera implies aggression.
Photographer's intentions can't be found in images.
The photograph is violent, not because it shows violent things, but because on each occasion it fills sight by force.
Trying to pinpoint photographic meaning outside a context of reception is useless.
To photograph is to appropriate the thing photographed.
Camera stands out as an instrument of power.
Nothing is more homogeneous than a pornographic photograph.
My model is here and there, which undermines dividing the world into spaces of self and other.
Even when photographers want to mirror reality, the imperatives of taste and conscience still haunt them.
Eroding the boundary between spectatorship and citizenship disrupts photojournalistic practices.
Photographers feel guilty that all they do for a living is press a button.
Unlike activities such as playing a musical instrument, photography requires little technical training.
The subgenre of street photography fills the niche of non-responsibility to the subject.
Photography is an act of non-intervention.
If your pictures aren't good enough, you aren't close enough.
The ordinary photographer takes the world as they see it.
Photography is like a found object.
Photographs furnish evidence.
To use a camera is to be in complicity with whatever makes a subject interesting.
Professional codes claim to guarantee photographic credibility.
The photographic catalogue of global misery and injustice familiarizes everyone with atrocity.
The proliferation of horrendous situations induces compassion fatigue.
The ethical content of photography is fragile.
Seems like everywhere you'd look, there was another body.
The truth is the best picture, the best propaganda.
Well, photographs may not lie, liars may photograph.
Using a camera is a form of participation.
If I could tell the story in words, I wouldn't need a camera.
The photographic plate does not interpret. It records with unquestionable precision and fidelity.
Objectivity is the essence of photography and its limitation.
In one version of its utility, the camera incriminates.
The artistic photographer is a dilettante artist.
People think appropriated photography is stealing, borrowing, or dumb.
In some cultures, photography is simply a process of image making rather than taking.
Time eventually positions photographs, even the most amateurish, at the level of art.
The responsibility of directing the camera toward truth rests with the human operator.
Every photograph reproduces, reaffirms, and reinforces the symbolic form of perspective.
A photograph is an image of concepts.
Because it compresses 4 dimensions into 2, photography is necessarily incomplete.
Photography grasps only fragments of a spatial or temporal continuum, while memory images retain what is significant.
The old notion of a blind spot suggests how perspective inscribes itself into the picture. Where is the blind spot?
Historicism is concerned with the photography of time, like a giant film depicting the flow of events from every standpoint.
The thought of eternal return is a premise of technological reproducibility.
The camera wields an absurd omniscience and an absurd omnipotence.
The world is filled with objects, more or less interesting. I do not wish to add any more. I prefer simply to state the existence of things.
The universe in its entirety works like a gigantic photographic machine.
The camera is an ancestor of the modern apparatuses which robotize all aspects of our lives, from our public acts to our innermost thoughts.
A digital camera turns the photographer into a robot with no feeling.
My photos are sterile and devoid of emotional content.
I hate cameras. They always interfere. They're always in the way.
I use photography to distance myself from a world I love and am powerless to improve.
The only way I can transform the photograph is into refuse, either the drawer or the wastebasket.
A photograph is both a pseudo-presence and a token of absence.
The photograph is a ruin.
The photograph ushers us into flat death.
The ability to create sudden death empowers the camera. Its click suspends life in an act that constitutes its essence.
Portraits bear witness to the recognition that we are most ourselves when we grasp the possibility of our death.
That camera is a portable tomb. You must remember that.